I'll go over this actually as we talk about it. So, okay, so this course is an introduction to traditional representational painting. So in the Western tradition, representational painting is based on conceptual systems that organize complex information. So what do I mean? And I know some people have been in my classes before, so you may know the answer to this, but when I say that this class is an introduction to representational painting, what does that mean? What does representational mean when we're talking about works of art? So it's a very common term when discussing works of art. But what does that mean?
Are we interrupting?
Yeah, you can interrupt. Yeah, that's a question to everybody.
And that I would say like a very kind of literal representation of what you're like physically presented with in front of you.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that. So,
Still life?
yeah, still life would be representational. So we're going to be talking about these images more in depth, but so that's a representational image, right? Anyone know who that artist is? So that's the painter Claude Monet. Anyone familiar with him? A French impressionist. So why is that representational? Like maybe based on your definition, Deborah. Like why is that? Why would we call that representational?
I think it's I think depicting in a more literal sense what he's seeing.
Yeah, so we call that representational. If we think about that word, representational, we could break it down into represent, right? So represent or present again. So a representational work of art is a work of art that presents to the viewer something that already exists in the world, right? So really, most art is representational, actually. So this is a representational painting because it's representing something that exists outside of the painting. So it's depicting or representing haystacks in the middle of the French countryside in the 19th century, right? So this is a representational painting. That's a representation of a male nude. This is a representational painting, like two ambassadors somewhere in Europe in the 16th century. What do we call this kind of painting? And so representational is usually abstract, right? So representational is usually thought about in contrast to abstract. And so this is an abstract painting by an artist named Joan Mitchell.
But wouldn't there be some kind of like overlay?
Yeah, for
At
sure.
least like I don't know, like a spiritual sense. Like if you go by the same representational definition, you can non-literally represent something that is in this world already.
Yeah, so like most art, most terms, I don't know if this is true really, but, like a lot of terms in art discourse, the meaning is imprecise. So Joan Mitchell herself, I don't know if this is true, but she, in a way, she thought of these as representational. Like she always thought of her landscape paintings as of her abstract paintings as being landscape based. And there are things about this painting that indicate that. Like you'll notice the blue is at the top. She arranges the green in relationship to the more neutral colors in a way that suggests a landscape. And then Joan Mitchell didn't really think of her paintings as spiritual, I don't think, but she thought of them as being about freedom, kind of like philosophical idea of freedom. Yeah. And so we could say that the painting represents that. So definitely, there's definitely overlap, and there is, and those terms are imprecise. And that's going to be the case with many of the terms we use. Having said that, the idea of representation in that the paintings we're going to be learning how to make are representational in the kind of conventional sense of that word. The paintings we're going to be making in this class are paintings where you are trying to successfully create the illusion of an object, of a three-dimensional object existing in space. You're trying to create the illusion of that on a flat surface. So that's going to be the objective of the class. Then I taught people, I'm not going to read this paragraph. I talk about some of the elements we'll be learning. There's no point in reading that right now because I don't think it would stick. We'll get into all that as we move through the course. So I do want to emphasize that I designed this class and teach it as a technical class. So we're learning a series of techniques. That's the objective of the class. That's certainly not the only way to teach art. And I think people should take a broad range of art courses. But I also think that it can be very valuable to teach a set of techniques and investigate them intensively as a way of creating a foundation that allows you to explore a wide range of other ways of working. So this is an online course, as people know. And so I have found with some experimentation since the spring that the best way to teach an online visual arts course is to have a combination of synchronous, which is a word I don't think I knew before the spring, synchronous sessions where we're all together online, and then asynchronous, where you are doing the work for the course, but we are not all online. So it's going to be a combination of those two approaches. So I do want to say this syllabus this is roughly what we're going to be doing. If you look at the lesson plan, I do always, I'm not going to guarantee that we're going to follow the lesson plan precisely day by day, because sometimes the needs of the class just require that we make some adjustments. And so we may do that. We will almost definitely do that to one degree or another. I think this class was pretty much the way it's written down, but we'll see. So grading, I do want to talk a bit at some length about grading, just because I've run into some issues with grading in the past year. So I want to make a few things clear. So the grade I give you, as you can see there on the grading evaluation table, is based primarily on basically how hard you work. That's what I mean by dedication and participation. So I do that for two reasons. One, I think that being willing to try certain techniques that you're not familiar with is very valuable for an artist. It doesn't mean that you're absolutely going to use those techniques as an artist for the rest of your career. But I think it's really important to experiment with them and have them become part of your knowledge base, whether you use them consistently or not. They somehow inform your visual and conceptual knowledge. Conceptual meaning the way you think about the art you make. So willingness to fully engage with the class lessons is, I think, a really important part, not only of the class, but of being an artist. And then dedication and participation is really important for an artist, because every artist I know who is successful is an incredibly hard worker. Now, there's this kind of romantic idea out there that artists don't do much until they're blessed with inspiration, and then they work feverishly, and then they don't do much. It's total nonsense. Every successful artist I know is constantly working. And that's the only way to succeed in this field. So I think in that way, dedication and participation is a really important thing to make part of your just make part of your approach to being an artist. And I always approach this class. I know not everyone here is an art major, but I teach this class as if everybody's an art major. So classwork is 20%, meaning the degree of success in mastering the technique that's addressed in class. I actually should use the phrase learning outcomes, even though I hate that phrase. That's one of these new education phrases, but you guys all may have encountered that more frequently. And then homework, I actually don't give a lot of homework in this class, or at least in the traditional sense, but that would be 20% of your grade. Okay, so this is where I give the meaning of the grades, primarily getting, and I indicate that in this information. Again, the first element in these strong grades is, I just repeat this sentence, student shows complete willingness to engage with the lesson at hand and to make a concerted effort to understand a lesson. So again, basically how hard you work to understand what we're covering in class and to make a work of art that shows your struggle to understand that. That's the most important thing. So your inherent ability, that thing that we call talent, whatever that is, or previous experience is less important than how willing you are to make a dedicated effort to understand what we're studying in the class. So that's the most important element. Things do come into play, like, an A will be different from a B plus if both students work as hard as each other, but one student is able to make a painting that just in a completely convincing way demonstrates those techniques. That will probably lead to a grade that's higher than a student who doesn't quite reach that level. And I think that's important to do with grades, just to communicate how well a student is understanding the material. It's just grades as assessment. In other words, it gives you information about how successfully you're mastering the content. So C plus and below is, primarily that's going to indicate that you just didn't put in an effort. That's primarily what will lead to any of these grades. Anyone who is an art major should know that in order for the class to count towards your major, you have to get at least a C plus or above. If you get a C or below, it doesn't count towards your major. So people should just know that. So I added this last night. Just a couple things I want to say about this entry here. I've never had it before. So note on grading. I consider grades to be an assessment how thoroughly you've mastered the subject matter and how dedicated and hardworking you were in that endeavor. So just what I said. So that's the only way I can arrive at a grade. So I cannot and do not give grades for any other reason. So in other words, I don't give grades because a student needs to maintain a certain GPA, no matter how passionately they tell me that, or because if they don't receive a certain grade, they won't graduate, or because it's important to their family that they graduate with honors, and so on. Those are things that are not within my power to influence or change, and if I adjusted grades for reasons such as those, then grades would have no meaning. So I bring that up because I had, in this class I just finished, and I'm not telling this story to, gossip, anything like that. I just want to make something clear because I think it's important to understand about grading. I had a student in my summer session class that just ended who disappeared after the first week. I never saw this student. Wasn't in any of my classes. And then submitted the last assignment. Had missed almost all the assignments, but submitted the last assignment and sent me an email thanking me for a great class and saying that she had wished it had been in person. So I was completely puzzled. And I let the student know that I had no basis to give her a grade, so I would have to give her a UW. And she got back in touch with me and said that this is the last class, she needs it in order to meet her credits, and could I at least give her a D? So I can't do that. I mean, I can't give grades for that kind of reason. And I just want to make that clear, that that's not something that I can do, or really any teacher should be expected to do that. So I'm not saying anyone here would ask for that. And, that doesn't, I have had situations like that in the past. It's not common. But I guess I also wanted to bring it up because I did wonder, I had a couple of situations in my last summer session class. I did wonder if there's an expectation that people can sort of like float through classes now that we're in online mode and you'll still pass. Because I know there was a directive that came out of the college.
I was just about to say that, sorry to interrupt you. I think that's because the college sent that email saying you weren't happy or something.
I mean, and that, to me that made sense because we were all thrown in such disarray by coronavirus and how we had to dramatically change in the middle of the semester and people had to adjust, maybe getting the technology. I had to buy some technology to make this work. But, that doesn't, actually that rule doesn't apply anymore. That applied just to the spring semester. So, so I can't, I do expect people to approach this class exactly as you are expected to approach, a regular in-session class. Having said that, if anybody has any kind of difficulty with technology, difficulty connecting, absolutely get in touch with me. Make sure my email, my cell phone is on the syllabus right here. Get in touch with me, let me know, and I will absolutely work hard to make sure you have the right means of getting on the class. But in general, the expectation is that you're here, every day essentially, or at least every day that we're meeting synchronously. So attendance in my classes is mandatory, but we spoke a little bit earlier about imprecise terms. So I say it's mandatory, but I do allow one unexcused absence per semester, no questions asked. And then each subsequent absence that is not accompanied by a doctor's note will negatively affect your dedication and participation grade. If I do allow that if you don't have a doctor's note, but you have some other family emergency, I will be pretty flexible in understanding that kind of thing as long as you email me that day. So you can't miss several classes and then email me and say, oh, by the way, something like that, because then it just doesn't work. Attendance, I do want to emphasize, is important in this class, daily attendance, because the lessons I cover are cumulative. In other words, what we study one day leads to what we're going to be studying the next day. So you're building up a base of knowledge. It's not, I don't teach lessons that are separate from one another. So it's really developing knowledge over the course of time. So that's an important part of the class, and that's why attendance is important. So illness, so if you become ill and have to miss several classes, that is a legitimate excuse. So if you become very ill and need to be out for, let's say, 4 or 5 days, and that may or may not be more of an issue. I guess it is more of an issue now. that's an acceptable excuse, but you do need medical documentation. And then in some cases, maybe the best thing to do would be to request an incomplete, so you have more time to finish the work.
I just have a comment. I mean,
Yeah.
I think I gave it to you in my email.
Yeah.
I'm not due till July 29th, which is like a week after the class is over, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Something happens
Yeah, of
before.
course, that would be acceptable. And we know due dates are not precise.
Yeah. But I plan on being in the class the entire time. So
Okay, great. So tardiness, so you should be on time for class. I'll take attendance at, around 9-10 every day. Give a little bit of time. So materials, I say should be purchased exactly as I described them on the syllabus. I will absolutely understand any kind of financial difficulties. You should talk to me about that. I do. I actually do have a lot of materials on campus. I haven't, if necessary, I would be willing to go there and get materials that I could give to people. Of course, you would have to meet me there. But if anyone needs that, we do have a lot of materials that have built up because of this. But if there are any other financial impediments that prevent you from purchasing materials, just speak to me about it and we'll work something out. So another thing, so attentiveness, that's a new entry as well. So I've noticed, and I even kind of understand this, but I've noticed with some people in the online classes that when I speak to them, let's say a day after the class or the next time we meet individually, they seem to be totally unaware of what might have happened or the information that might have been discussed in one of our online classes. So I wonder, this may not be true, but I wonder if some people during online classes are either going on their phone or taking care of other business, and like half listening or not listening at all. And I'm a parent. I have 2 kids. I'm constantly distracted by things I need to do for them. I understand all that. And it's easy during online classes like this to be pulled away by something that you can do because we generally don't see each other. You can even look at your phone and I don't even realize it, right? When I'm looking at the screen. And I have to admit, the other day I was doing a parent meeting with a group of other parents for my kid's school. It got so boring. I started looking at my phone and I realized I could do it and not look like I was looking at my phone. The problem is if you do that in the class and you miss information, then you're not going to have the right information, that you need to solve the problem we're dealing with. So you need to, both in order to get the most out of the class as possible, but also to, so that you're prepared to do the assignments that are given, you need to be paying attention during these online sessions. I hope I'm not boring. You all are the ones who can tell me that. But you do really need to stay attentive. I think it's obviously important, right? This class is about providing information and then trying to use that information to develop your abilities to make paintings. So just please bear that in mind. So homework is always announced on a Thursday. Again, it's a little bit, I do assign some homework, and then some homework is just to complete the paintings that we've been doing asynchronously. Camera use, I prefer when everybody's on camera because to me it seems more like a class. But I know some people have privacy concerns, and I know it takes up bandwidth. So I'll just throw that out there as a preference. So academic honesty. So that's another new entry with online teaching. So the way I've been doing online teaching is I do, and people who have been in my class know I do this anyway. I do a lot of demos. So we're going to be learning a certain technique, learning certain concepts of painting, and I'll demonstrate them. So I will do a little version of the kind of problems that we're going to be dealing with. With online teaching, because there isn't that really crucial element of all of us being together in the same class and having the opportunity to provide feedback right there while you're working on your painting, it's become, I think, even more important to do a thorough demo. So I can clearly talk about, explain, and show the way to solve certain problems of representational painting. And then what I ask you to do is set up something similar and make your own painting given that set of problems. But that doesn't mean that the painting you submit should be a copy of mine, right? It's like, I'm gonna post my demos so that I'll post them on Blackboard so that it's available to you to look at. But I wanna be clear, the work I ask you to do following the demonstration isn't just copying my painting. It's setting up your own painting, along those lines, and then doing your own painting. So just make sure that there's no ambiguity about that. You should set up something that's clearly different from the painting I set up. And in addition to that, this is just like any other kind of academic honesty. You shouldn't look for a painting online that, and I'm not saying anyone would do this, but just so it's clear, you shouldn't just be copying somebody else's painting that's already online, or something like that. It's really about looking at something in the world and trying to make a representation of that. And so that's something I emphasize a lot in my classes, is because it's both it's sort of an obvious aspect of painting, but actually one that we don't think about too much, which is that what we are trying to do in this class is take a flat surface, right, the surface of the canvas or the surface of the board, and we're trying to convince the viewer that that flat surface is not a flat surface. We're trying to convince the viewer that instead of looking at a flat surface, the viewer is looking at a space that's opening up before them that is occupied by completely convincing three-dimensional objects. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And in order to really study that, or really to master that, you really want to be making a painting while looking at actual three-dimensional objects in the world. So to really understand that concept, you can't be looking at somebody else's painting and copying it, or you can't be looking at a photograph. That's a different sensibility. So what we're going to be doing in this class is working directly from life, never working from photographs. It is valuable to copy other artists' work in some ways, because you can learn certain things. By doing that, you can learn the way they understood certain concepts of painting, or the way they understood them and then executed them. But that's a different thing. We won't be doing that in this class, just because it just doesn't fit into the schedule. So, so tomorrow we will be doing our first demonstration. I'm going to be demonstrating what's called a grisaille still life. So this word here, grisaille, like a lot of words in painting discourse, it comes from the French. A lot of words in painting discourse come from Italian. This just means, I think that just means something like gray, like having to do with gray or grayish. Gris is the French word for gray. So we're going to be starting by studying value by doing a very simple black and white still life. So tomorrow, I'll be running the class from my studio, and I'll be doing a demonstration. I'll talk about how to set up your own demonstration. We'll talk about all that thoroughly. And then the next day, so that will be Wednesday, will be an asynchronous session. So that's a block of time where you're expected to set up the still life and do the work from the still life. I'm always available during asynchronous sessions. If you need some feedback, you can text me, send me an email, but probably texting me is the fastest way to get my attention. And I'm happy to give feedback. Obviously on asynchronous days, you could do that still life at any time you want, right? So there's that flexibility, scheduling flexibility, which is an advantage too. But I generally won't be available other than during class time. I mean, you could try me, but I just may not be available. So I just want to make sure people understand that. On Thursday, we'll do another demo, and then the schedule will go that way going forward, okay? I'm not going to go over all these individual lessons because we'll talk about these when the times come, as the days come. The day I do a demo, I will always, or almost always, I think always, start by showing you some images that also introduce the demonstration. And so that's going to be the basic approach to the course. Does anybody have any questions about any of the class requirements or the way I give grades, anything like that? Any questions for that matter about materials?
Yes.
Huh?
I didn't get it on the syllabus.
Yes?
Where can we find the materials? Because I couldn't find it on the syllabus last night.
Oh, okay. So I've sent out several emails, but who is this?
Romani?
Did you just enroll in the class?
Yes.
Okay. So I will send that out again today. I have a materials list. I'll forward you those emails. Did you get my emails last night?
Last night I did, yes.
Okay, so I'll forward you that information. You can get it. You can get them at Dick Blick. Dick Blick is now is not open. Like you can't walk into the store, but you can arrange for either them to deliver from New York to your home, or you can arrange curbside pickup.
If you live in Long Island, you're allowed to go into the store.
Oh, are you? Oh, okay.
The one in Carl Place.
Oh, that's good. It's good to know. Is that near you, Carl Place?
No, I live in the Lower East Side.
You live on the Lower East Side. Okay, but you could go, like there's a Blick on Bond Street. Do you know where that is?
Yeah, I do.
And I mean, the Blicks in Manhattan are all doing, pretty robust curbside pickup. So, okay, so let's see.
Professor, I have another question.
Yes.
So I have most of my materials arrived, but only the canvas, the size 12 by 16 canvas, because Blick is out of stock.
Okay.
So when we will use the canvas?
Well, you need a canvas for the first painting you do. You can, is it back ordered? I think that those are back ordered for a while, aren't they?
Uh-huh.
I mean, you can get a different size canvas.
Okay.
Did you get the canvas pad?
Yeah.
Okay, you can use that for the first painting.
Okay.
And
You
then
mean for
order,
the first week?
yeah, you can use that for the first. And then you can order, you can order like 11 by 14, something like that.
Okay.
Any size in that range is fine. I know the 12 by 16 is out.
Hmm.
You can
Okay,
also,
but Michael's has 12 by 16.
yeah, that's fine. Get it from Michael's. It's totally fine. And you can get another brand. It's totally fine.
Yeah. Okay.
If people
you.
can get the materials at Michael's, that's fine.
It's cheaper.
Is it cheaper? Okay. My only problem with Michael's is that they're often out of things, but that's fine.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, because the store just very close to my home is out of store. So I need to go to another place.
Okay, yeah, but that's fine, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so so another thing I added last night, photographing your work when you submit it to me. So I have a set of instructions on photographing work. I just want to go over this. So there's a few things you should do. You should make sure the work is well lit. So these are someone else's, like an online how to photograph your work with an iPhone. And that's, I think, what most people are going to be doing. So you should photograph your work so that it's well lit. So the best thing to do is something like this. Put your work painting on a table next to a window. That's going to provide good light for the painting. You don't want direct sunlight coming in the window. So if direct sunlight's coming in, that won't work. It should be indirect sunlight. But if you have another way of lighting the painting well, that's totally fine. This is a good way to do it, a good, easy way. Just lay it on a table next to a window, or for that matter, next to an open door. Like you could open for those of you who maybe live in a house or have a door that leads out to a balcony, something like that, you open the door, put the painting on the floor next to the door, and that's going to provide very good lighting. Okay. And then, And then take the photograph so that the painting is square to the camera lens. In other words, so that there's no distortion, so that the painting is square to the frame of the camera. Does that make sense? Like you want the edges to be parallel to the edge of the frame. In other words, don't take your photograph so that the painting is distorted like this, right? Like don't take the photograph so that the painting's smaller at the bottom than at the top, because then I can't really see the painting, right? You're not showing me the painting as if I'm looking straight at it. So you want to photograph the painting so that the edges are parallel to the edges of the camera lens or the edges of the camera frame, so that the painting is square to the camera lens. And again, I think a good way of doing that is taking your painting, putting it on the floor, again, next to a door or next to a window, and then photographing the painting from above. So you're going to photograph it from above like this, very carefully making sure that that painting is square to the viewfinder on your camera. The other thing to not do, and this is really important if I'm going to really be able to see the work you do in the painting, don't include this kind of clutter in the background. Like I don't want to see wallpaper. I don't want to see the contents of your desk. Not because anything's wrong with your wallpaper, obviously, but I want to just see your painting. I don't want to be distracted by unnecessary visual information. That's so that I can see your painting, but also you want your work to show its qualities to its best advantage. You don't want the painting you're submitting for grading to be confused by all this stuff around it. And you don't want it to be confused by, this distorted angle, right? So again, photograph the painting so it's square, as best you can do, at least. And then, use your iPhone or your smartphone photo editing program, which is, you know, part of all phones, to crop the painting. So it's very, you know, if people don't have a phone that does this, then just let me know. But, you know, almost all phones, you know, going back several generations, have this program where you can crop the painting. It's easy to figure that out. I'm not very tech savvy, but I can figure it out. So you crop the painting with that, and then you can submit just the painting itself. Now you should try your best to just submit the painting cropped to itself. You know, again, you want it square to the camera, you don't want stuff behind it, and you want it well lit. That's important because, you know, we're at a disadvantage, right? We're not able to look at each other's work in person, but we want to be able to see the work to its best advantage. So spend a few minutes. I don't think this is going to take a lot of time for people to figure this out. Spend a few minutes trying to figure out how to get the best possible image that you can send to me for submission. I do include some information there. There's a good free app. I downloaded it last night. I used it a little bit. And again, I am not good at technology. I'm not a lover of technology. I use it because we have to. But there's a free app called Snapseed, which has a whole range of photo editing options that go beyond what your phone is able to do. I know it's available for iPhone. I know it's available for Android. I can't guarantee it's available for all smartphones, but probably something like that is. And then actually, I meant to include a link to a YouTube video that shows how to edit with Snapseed. It's actually, for anyone here who's an artist and is going to be taking photographs of their own work, Snapseed and that YouTube video that shows how to edit works of art, to photograph and edit works of art with Snapseed is useful. And then finally, and I will talk about this more, if possible, I would ask everybody to submit your photograph to me. I mean, the photograph of your artwork named in this manner, so if possible, rename the work you're submitting using this format: last name _ first name _ project name. So in other words, if I were submitting a photograph to myself, it would say Kauper _ Kurt _ first still life.jpg. Now I can't believe phones don't allow you to do this. I only just found that out in my last class. But if you put the photo in Photoshop or in you know, whatever photo editing software comes with your computer, you should be able to do that. Now, if people don't have that photo editing software, again, you know, just let me know. And you know, Photoshop's very expensive. You can actually get free versions of Photoshop. You can get free knockoffs of Photoshop that are very, very good, that provide most of the information.
What's the name of the website, Professor?
I'm sorry?
What is the name of the website?
I don't know, but I'll find out and I'll send it to you. I don't remember right now.
Okay.
But actually, it's a very good, it's totally free.
Okay.
You know, it's not quite as expensive, but you can do most things. So I'll find out. But if you cannot name it this way, at least when you send it to me in the subject line of your email, put last name, first name, project title. Just because, you know, I get all these emails and sometimes I lose track of whose work it is. So please try to do that. So this is, so these instructions are included in the updated syllabus that'll be on Blackboard. I'll also I'll include these as a separate PDF document. So again, I don't I really don't think it would take long to figure out how to make your photograph, presentable this way. I mean, if you look at this isn't such a great painting, but, if we look at this painting, we're just looking at the painting, right? So we're able to engage much more fully with the work the artist did. In the painting, even though we can't see the whole thing. We're able to much better engage with that painting. So looking at this is much more, we can just look at the painting. I would be able to talk about this painting much more clearly. I'm able to see the colors better. I'm able to see what the artist wanted to do much better than if I'm looking at a painting that's shown to me like this. Right? So you want to figure out how to take an image of your painting that shows it off that shows off its best characteristics. So, give yourself some time to figure that out. Again, I do not think it is difficult to figure out. And if anyone has any questions or needs some help on that, I'm happy to give it. Okay, so this is a list of art supply stores. Dick Blick is opening up everywhere, so that it may have changed. If anyone has access to one of these are pretty good. Artisan Craftsman Supply. Unfortunately, the great New York City art stores that used to exist don't exist anymore, all the independent ones. It's so shocking. There used to be a great art supply store named, now I forget. That history's been wiped out. What was it called? It was on 3rd Avenue. Doesn't matter. Doesn't exist. But everything's now Dick Blick. Everything's a chain. But Dick Blick is fine. You can generally, I think, get better deals if you get Dick Blick online. But if you bring your ID, when you go to the store, you do get a 10% discount. Okay, so if there are any questions about that, you can let me know. Anything about the syllabus.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
So this class is okay for people who don't have experience with painting at all?
This class is designed for people who don't have experience with painting. So yes, absolutely.
So Professor, tomorrow we have to paint in Zoom, like it will be live painting, or?
Yeah, well, tomorrow I'm going to be doing a demonstration. I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be giving suggestions on how to set things up so you can work at home, different things you're going to need. It's going to be a little bit of you're going to need to do some like setting up and arranging. And I'll talk about, if anyone has any questions about the safety of using these materials at home. The materials we use are safe, but some people may have questions about them. I'll talk about how you can dispose of oily rags, that kind of thing, like a safe way to do that. So I'll go over all that stuff tomorrow, and I will be doing a demonstration. Okay. We'll look at some images just to get an idea of some things we'll be studying. So I actually wanted to start with this. This is an excerpt from an essay called Art as Technique, or sometimes it's translated as Art as Device. It's an essay by a Russian formalist literary critic. So Russian formalism was an early 20th century literary movement that became very influential, much more broadly than just in literature. It was very influential not only to art, but to linguistics. And the writer of this essay is I don't know if it's blocked on my screen. His name's Victor Shklovsky, Shklovsky. And so I mentioned earlier that this class is a technique-driven class. So I teach a set of techniques. And on the one hand, you might think that these techniques are very specific and they teach you to do a kind of limited set of things. And that's true in a sense, in the sense that what I teach is concentrated, it's intensive, and it's a limited set. In other words, we teach these, 5 or 6 things. And they are 5 or 6 things that I consider to be foundational to painting, right? So they are fundamental techniques of painting. I had a colleague many years ago at one of the first jobs I had, and I remember him saying that teaching technique in beginning painting was very important because what you learn is both fundamental and profound. And I'd never heard anyone say that. I never really thought about that. But that's really true. What we're going to be learning in this class is fundamental. In other words, it's introductory elements of painting. But those fundamental things can be used in very profound ways. Like those fundamental things can be used to communicate both artistic, visual, we sometimes refer to those things as formal experiences, but also conceptual, cultural, philosophical experiences as well. And so I think in that way, what we're going to be studying in the class can be very valuable to an artist. But I also think that what we're studying, even if you're not an artist, even if you end up not being an artist in your life, I do think that what I teach in this class, and I'm not the only one who teaches this, so I don't mean to sound that way. But what you can learn in a class like this is you learn how to see the world much more completely and with much more intensity. And I think that's actually an incredibly valuable thing to develop. I think it allows you to see the world with a complexity and a richness that you just didn't see before. And I think that has really profound and broad implications, not only artistically, but even politically, intellectually, and so on. I do think that after taking this class, you will see the world differently, like even in a very basic way. And I think that can be a very meaningful thing. So I've always loved this excerpt about that. So if we start reading here, so Shklovsky starts this excerpt by taking a section of Leo Tolstoy's diary. Anyone know who Leo Tolstoy was? Who was Tolstoy?
An author?
Yeah, Tolstoy was a very famous author. Like he arguably he wrote the most famous novel ever. Anyone know what he wrote? Anyone knows any of his works?
Is it A Tale of Two Cities? Or
Tale of Two Cities is Dickens.
Oh, all right.
Anyone know what Tolstoy wrote?
Mm.
So Tolstoy wrote War and Peace. Have people heard of War and Peace? Maybe arguably the most famous novel ever written. It's a great novel, if anyone wants to take time to read it. He also wrote a book called Anna Karenina, which is also a famous novel. So Shklovsky is starting this excerpt with a section of Tolstoy's diary. So this is Tolstoy speaking. So I was dusting in the room. Having come full circle, I approached the sofa and could not remember if I had dusted it off or not. So Tolstoy's recounting something that we've probably all experienced, right? You're engaged in some like everyday activity and you can't actually remember doing it. Like, has anyone ever been driving for long distances on the highway and you come to a realization at a certain point that you've traveled 100 miles, but you don't remember any of the landmarks? You don't remember noticing any of the exits. You were just in a kind of like automatic consciousness. It happens a lot with driving, a kind of like automatic, you go into this kind of like automatic robotic mode. So he's describing that experience. I was dusting in the room. Having come full circle, I approached the sofa and could not remember if I had dusted it off or not. I couldn't because these movements are routine and not conscious, and I felt I never could remember it. So if I had cleaned the sofa but forgotten it, that is if this was really unconscious. It is if this had never happened. If somebody had watched consciously, reconstruction would have been possible. But if nobody watched consciously, if the whole life of many people is lived unconsciously, it is as if this life had never been. And I think that actually describes the way we often go through our lives. We go into a kind of automatic mode. We stop looking intensively. We stop thinking intensively. We stop engaging in an intense, critical, questioning way with the world. And, I think that that we, all of us alive now in 2020, are more susceptible to that than ever before. And that's not a generational thing. It's me as much as anybody in this class. I'm 53. It's as much a case for me as it is for somebody 20. Because we are surrounded by technology that allows us to experience the world without actually looking at the world. That's actually really a problem, I think. And again, I'm not criticizing a generation. It's as much a problem for me and people of my generation it is for anybody. But I think we fall into that robotic, automatic way of engaging with the world. So then Shklovsky goes on to say, and Shklovsky is asking the question, why do we consider art valuable? So he brings up that essay of Tolstoy, and then he says, starting here, this is how life becomes nothing and disappears. Automation eats things, clothes, furniture, your wife, and the fear of war. So automation meaning, we become automatic, we become robotic. It makes our complete engagement with things, clothes, furniture, our spouse, cataclysmic events in the world like war, it turns us into automatic robots. If the whole complex life of many people is lived unconsciously, it is as if life had never been. And so what we call art exists in order to give back the sensation of life, in order to make us feel things, in order to make the stone stony. The goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing. The goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing and not merely recognizing things. The device of art, or the purpose of art, is the ostrananie, that's a Russian word for estrangement, is the estrangement of things and the complication of form, which increases the duration and complexity of perception. So in other words, art is meant to estrange the world. In other words, art is meant to make us really take note of the world, to really take note of things we may otherwise just passively recognize and not really think about and not really engage with. And I think that's I think that that's true. This is written in 1916, so over 100 years ago. But I think that that is why we consider art valuable. For all of the efforts to define art since then, and all of the kind of hand-wringing as to whether or not art is important or it's just a kind of luxury activity, I think that this remains really what is valuable about art. It makes us see the world as if we had never seen it before. It restarts our engagement with the world and allows us to be thinking, curious, critical, engaged. It allows us to maintain a thinking, curious, critical engagement with the world. And that, I think, allows us to be successful no matter what we're doing, no matter what people go on to become. I think if you're going to succeed in that field, you can't be automatic about it. You have to engage with that field in a curious, critical, constantly thinking way. And I am convinced that that our engagement with art prompts us to do that, and that studying art helps us bring that into every other aspect of our lives. So this is a painting again by Claude Monet, who is a famous artist in many ways. I mean, he's a well-known artist in the sense that he's a kind of popularly known artist. But he's also a great artist. He's very popular, like his paintings are on the sides of shopping bags from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but that doesn't mean he's not a great artist. So I just want to ask a few things about this painting. Many things that Monet is doing in this painting are things that we're going to be studying. We're going to be concentrating on how you see the world and the way Monet is seeing the world. So I just want to ask a few questions about what's going on here. So can anyone, if I were to ask what is the temperature of the light in this painting? Now, I do realize that people may never have thought of the temperature of light or the temperature of color. It's going to be an important thing we talk about in this class. But just looking at this painting, can anyone tell me what the temperature of the light is?
It's in K, I forget, but I don't know, 3.
Wait, how did you just describe it in terms of K?
Yeah, in K.
Okay, so that's probably getting more technical than I want to go.
Oh,
That's in terms of, what is that, Kelvin?
Kelvin, yeah. Well, I was thinking photography, I guess.
Yeah, no, you know, it could be helpful to go that deep. But what about, let's just say warm and cool, because that's more what we're going to be talking about. So is the temperature of this light warm or is it cool?
I would say warm.
Warm, right. So this is a warm light. And so how do you know it's a warm light?
Because of the colors, they're earth tones, brownish, green.
Yeah, so the colors where?
On the huts or hay? I'm sorry, hay.
Yeah, so are you talking about like the colors here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so those are warm, right? That's true. Does everybody see that? Does anyone have a question as to why we would identify these colors as warm? But what about these colors? Are these colors warm?
No, cool.
Those are cool, right? Who's saying that?
Selena.
Helena. What about this? Is that warm or cool? This color here.
It's neutral.
Yeah, we could maybe say that's neutral. Who said that?
Melody.
Melody. Yeah, we could say that. Can you explain what neutral is in this regard?
Neutral color is kind of the combination of the warm color and the cool color.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's actually accurate. I would call this a neutral color that's tending towards the cool, right? It's closer to cool than to warm, but that's true. It's a neutral color. What about this color here?
It's
Warm.
cool.
Cool, right? So so why do we call this color cool and this color warm? Why do we do that?
This one is bright, right?
It's bright, yeah. This is bright. It's not so much brightness. If we're talking about relative brightness in a painting,
And
what's the term we use?
and also light, maybe the light focused on here.
That's true, but there can be cool light. Isn't that true? So it doesn't necessarily have to do with the light shining on something, like, because some light is cool. Isn't that true?
Yes.
But what is this light? What is the source of this light?
Sunlight.
The sun. It's direct sunlight on a clear day. So sunlight, direct sunlight is hot, right? That's the temperature of direct sunlight. So that's making these colors that are illuminated directly by the sun, it's making these warm. Why are these cool?
It doesn't have direct sunlight, so
It doesn't have direct sunlight. So the sun is not hitting that area. Or it's not directly hitting that. The sun is also not directly hitting this area, right? So that's cool. The sun's not directly hitting the roof of that house. So that's cool, or it's, as I think Melody said, it's neutral, but it's tending to cool. But why is it cool? Like, why should it, just because the direct sunlight is not hitting this, what would make that cool? Or this? What accounts for the fact that that's cool?
The temperature, I guess.
Well, the temperature is cool, but why? Like, why cool here? Like, why couldn't it just be? There's no light hitting it. Why couldn't it just be darker but warm?
Because it's cooler in shadows, like physically.
You mean when you're in shadows, the temperature drops? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think there's
I mean, realistic.
correlation there.
I actually don't. That's not what's happening, actually. But we do use the terms warm and cool in a kind of metaphorical way related to that. But that's actually not the reason this is a cool color, or this is a cool color. Can anyone guess? And let me just to clarify that. And these are all things we're going to be really intensively looking at as we're making our paintings. But this is all shadow, right? This part of the haystack is all in shadow. And
Is it because you mix the color with something that's not like an earth tone color, like maybe like a bluer, or I forget what it's called, like
well, that is how the artist made this color. But the reason this is cool
is because the viewer's feeling.
I'm sorry?
It's the viewer's feeling. It's like the psychologically you feel it's warm.
Well, not in this case. You mean the viewer is?
I mean, when people see like the orange, red, the colors.
I'm sorry.
They
Just
feel.
excuse me for 1 second. Just give me 1 second, and then we'll pick that up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just had to. Do you mean that the painter wants to communicate a certain psychological or emotional condition?
I mean, warm and cool color because it depends on people's feeling when they see the warm color like red, orange, yellow. They feel it's warm. They feel.
Yeah. Yes, that's why we use those words. That's true. But that's not why this is cool. The question is why, like why did Monet see cool colors here and paint cool colors? So Monet is trying to capture what he was seeing. That's a characteristic of Impressionism. So I'm curious why people think, or like what might be the answer as to why this part of the haystack is cool. But if we look at other parts of the shadow, like if we look at the shadow underneath the overhang of the hay, that's warm, right? This is warm. There's a little bit of warmth over here. So the question is why is that complexity of color happening? So this part of the haystack is warm because the local color is being illuminated by a warm light source. So because of the temperature of the light source, the warmth of that light source, we see those colors as warm.
So maybe the reflection of the other is something cooler, like water or
Right. So it has to do with reflection.
Okay.
So in theory, if we are looking, if light is hitting this part of the haystack, but no light was hitting this part of the haystack, if there were no light hitting that part of the haystack, we wouldn't see anything at all. Like the only reason we can see is because light hits objects and then reflects back to our eye. So there is some light hitting this object over here. It's just not direct light. But what's happening is light is hitting this part of the object directly. It's hitting this part of the object directly. It's hitting most parts of the field directly. And so those colors we're perceiving as warm because it's being illuminated with warm light. Now, these parts of the objects are not getting direct light, but they're getting some light. Otherwise, we just wouldn't be able to see it. So what's happening is light is reflecting off of multiple surfaces. So why is this temperature warm and this temperature cool? Can anyone guess what the light is reflecting off of to give that bluishness to that part of the haystack? Like there's something blue reflecting light back into the shadow.
water possibly?
Not water, there's something even more obvious. Like what is this angle of the haystack facing?
Tree.
Not the tree.
Maybe another haystack.
The mountains?
No. Something that on a clear day, all of us can see it no matter where we are.
God.
The sky, that's right. So light is bouncing off the innumerable particles of atmosphere in the sky, which overall has a bluish color, and then faintly bouncing back and giving a kind of bluishness to this part of the haystack. So, and you'll notice that if you're outside, next time you're outside, look at the tops of objects, like the tops of cars, the tops of reflective surfaces. If they're not being hit by direct light, you'll notice that the tops of objects are slightly bluer than other sides of the objects because they're getting light reflecting off the sky. So that's primarily what's reflecting light back into here. It's also the reason we see these colors here as neutral tending towards blue. That's why we see these colors as blue. because they're not getting hit by direct light, and the only light that's reflecting back into them is the light from the sky. But what's reflecting light back into here?
It's bouncing off the ground, I think.
Right, it's bouncing off the ground. It's bouncing off the relatively warm color of the hay or the grass, you know, and probably dirt. So warm color. So light hits, it doesn't hit this part of the haystack directly. It bounces off surfaces around it. And then we sometimes, and this is not a technical term, but we sometimes say then it inherits some of that color. And it bounces that color back in to the surfaces of the object that are not directly facing the light. So anything on this object that is facing the reflecting surface of the warmth of the field is getting a warm shadow reflection. This part is facing the sky. And so that's how we see color. We actually don't see color in the kind of everyday way that we usually name color. Like if someone were to ask us, what is the color of hay? We would all probably say it's tan or beige or light brown or something like that. But we actually don't see color that way. We never see color as simple local color. So local color meaning, you know, the color we conventionally name something. Like I'm going to hold up my coffee cup. Can everyone see that? The local color of that coffee cup is orange. But we never see color that way. Like if the local color of the hay is light brown or beige, what we actually see is a complex web of blue, orange, pale yellow, a kind of neutral brown. We see this complexity of color in a ordered arrangement. So similar to this painting of a male nude. So this is a painting from around 1800. It was a student painting by a very famous artist. He's actually not a household name, but he's very famous to artists. His usually English speakers pronounce his name Ang, like the corner of a room, or like the corner of a, no, that's wrong. Like angle, without the L, Ang. But his name is spelled Ingres. So this is a painting he did when he was a student. He was about 20. And, you know, people could do that at that time because they had probably been studying for about 8 years at that time. That's how people studied back then. So in some ways, I show this painting because even though we're not going to be painting the figure, we're just not at that stage yet. The things that Ang is doing in this painting are things that we're going to be studying. So, and it's also related to the Monet painting. So Ang is making this painting very conscious of thinking about how light falls on an object. Ang is completely understanding how light falls on an object. So in other words, he's identifying the light mass, the dark mass. He's identifying what happens within the dark mass. He's thinking about how color changes in the dark mass, depending on what the different planes of the object are facing. So what I mean by that is you'll notice on the arm of the figure, the shadow of the arm goes from a color that's warmer here to a color that's cooler here, right? Or we could say that it goes from a color that's more orange to a color that's more blue. So why is the color more orange here than here? So anyone, just based on what we've talked about, can anyone guess?
I'd say it's reflecting off of his body.
Right. So the part of the skin in shadow here is much closer to his torso. So this shadow is getting a much stronger reflection of light from the torso. And what happens is light will hit skin, and it will, because skin is translucent, it passes through the skin a little bit and picks up some of the color of the blood vessels and the relatively warm color of the skin, and then bounces back into the shadow, having inherited or having taken some of that warm color with it. There's less reflection of that warmth down here because the arm is further away from the body. So it's getting less of that reflection. If we could look close in on this painting, you would see some reflected red in his thumb. There's some reflected orange here from light reflecting off the arm here, the arm here. There's a complicated system of light and shadow that's allowing to see this figure. So it has to do with light, it has to do with dark, it has to do with what we call reflected light. It has to do with this dark area of shadow that we call the core of the shadow. We'll get into all of that in the next few days. These are all elements of representational painting we're going to be studying. We're going to be basically understanding how to make convincing illusion of three-dimensional volume in a believable three-dimensional space by understanding things like light, shadow, how we perceive color depending on different attributes of light and shadow or the specific light and shadow we're looking at. We'll be studying certain drawing issues. So we're going to be studying all of these fundamental issues of drawing and painting. This is also, I think, just a great painting in other ways. It's getting a little bit too complicated to talk about here today. It's a very simple painting, but in spite of its simplicity, I think it's a great painting. So again, you might think that what we're studying can be used because of the nature of what we're going to be studying. I think sometimes people think, well, what we're going to be studying can only be used for, like, let's say this kind of painting. Or, this is a very famous painting by Hans Holbein, great painting. We might think the techniques we're studying are used for this kind of painting or this kind of painting, maybe at an extreme limit. But really it's not true. So we're going to be learning fundamental properties of painting that certainly, like, if you developed them to a very high level, you could do something like this, possibly. If you had obviously this is a very talented person doing this painting. Another great painting. Anyone familiar with this painting? Can everyone hear me, or am I frozen?
Me of this picture of this painter. Is he from Van Eyck? I don't know. I don't remember.
No, that's a good guess. It looks like Van Eyck. I mean, he shared certain attributes with Van Eyck. He's about 100 years later.
Oh, okay.
That's a good guess.
Years, I guess.
This was in my history textbook in college.
Okay, that makes sense, because it was a painting that commemorated the attempt to reconcile Protestantism and Catholicism in the 1500s. So I can see it being used in a history textbook. Anyone know there's a very famous element in this painting. Anyone know what it is?
Is it fresco?
Yeah, so for anyone who's not familiar with this painting, this ambiguous element down here is actually a skull. So when you look at the painting from the bottom right corner, especially if you're in the room where the painting is, this distortion, because of the way you're looking at the painting from a distorted angle, this ambiguous element corrects itself into a skull. And so, you know, it's most likely that what the artist was doing was he was making a painting that was about the the attempt to negotiate and reconcile the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism. And these are paintings of the two ambassadors. This is the ambassador from the court of Henry VIII, and this is a French ambassador. No, this is the French ambassador to the court of Henry VIII, and then this is an ambassador from the Catholic Church. And they're surrounded by all these elements that represent worldly learning and worldly art. And there's an elaborate symbology. So for example, the string on the lute is broken to represent the discord that was existing historically at that time. And then Holbein threw in this thing. You know, it's kind of a brilliant narrative gesture because it's intended to remind viewers that no matter how engaged you are with all of this stuff of the world, ultimately everybody dies, right? It's a memento mori. And kind of a brilliant gesture, I think. I don't think that's why this painting is great. I think that there are much more complex reasons. But again, that's a little bit beyond what we're talking about today at any rate. But the main point is what we're studying in this class is not just intended to lead to this kind of painting. So we could take a much later painting. So I mentioned earlier that this was by an artist named Joan Mitchell. And this was painted in 1957. Anyone know what movement this is associated with? Like, what do we call this kind of painting?
Abstract painting.
Abstract. It's called, I mean, this is in general abstract painting. So the word, by the way, the word abstract just means away from the real. That's why that term has become used to describe this kind of painting. You know, the idea that this is somehow like removed from the real. Although, as we talked about earlier, in some ways we could think about this as representing things that are very much real, like emotional states or psychological states. So it is abstract, but there's a specific movement of abstraction. And I'm wondering if anybody knows what specific movements in the mid-20th century this would be associated with. So does anyone know abstract expressionism? Anyone heard of that movement? So abstract expressionism was a very influential, you know, it's usually talked about as an American art movement, but it was actually international. And it was a period where there was a complete break away from any kind of overtly representational elements in the painting, although again, that's not even entirely true. And it was a period when artists were making paintings that were intended to provide an experience that, it was a time when artists thought that the role of art was to provide an elevated psychological, emotional, spiritual experience for the viewer. And they were very pointedly thinking about their work as being an alternative to mass culture. Like artists at this period thought of mass culture as being necessarily detrimental or necessarily toxic. And so they thought of their art as an experience that allowed the viewer an experience that somehow rose above, you know, the kind of like everyday garbage of mass culture. It was just the way they thought. I mean, artists don't think that much anymore. But that was certainly the way these artists thought. Like these artists thought that it was only through paintings or a certain kind of music that you could authentically experience human freedom, or that you could authentically experience human subjectivity. Like be in touch with what was really true about being a human. Like most things in life, according to these artists, distracted you from those experiences. So, that's a very kind of romantic discourse, but that's what motivated their paintings. So, again, that gets a little bit beyond what we're talking about in this class, although I think it's a fascinating period in art history. But this is also a painting that, I don't want to speak for people in this class, but often when I show this painting initially in a class, people just think of it as kind of chaotic or a kind of mess, no order to it. But this is actually an incredibly ordered, incredibly organized, and incredibly complex painting. And so I just want to throw it out there. Like, does anyone, how do people respond to this painting? What do people see happening in this painting?
Aggression.
Yeah, aggression. And Joan Mitchell's paintings, they are, I think it's fair to characterize them as having a certain kind of aggressiveness to them. There is always a kind of underlying anger or a sense of that in Joan Mitchell's work. And she was kind of an angry person. She was not a person who was happy with the world. So, that's true. And in that way, I think in that way you see, something you often see in works of art, which is somehow an attribute of the work that communicates a kind of like general sensibility of the artist, and that can always be an interesting thing. What else? Any other comments about the painting?
I think it's very beautiful.
Very beautiful. I agree.
Like the rain in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. She always thought about her paintings as landscapes, so I think that makes sense. And I think you can see, at least I do, I think you can see a kind of landscape arrangement, a kind of landscape color thinking in the painting. Again, I mentioned this earlier, the blues tend to the top. There's a kind of green spread throughout it. We have colors that suggest the earth at the bottom. There's a kind of tree formation to this painting, a very abstract one. But she did think about her paintings as being kind of abstract equivalents to landscape. There's also a bit of a feeling of light passing through trees, something like that. So that's all in the painting. And I think her work is an interesting kind of tension between anger and beauty. I think that's very perceptive. I think that's always true of her work. What about space? Does anyone see space in this painting? In other words, a sense that certain elements in the painting are closer to us and other elements are further away.
I was going to say that brush strokes are strategically, I guess, placed to seem like they're some stuff is in the foreground and like you're moving further back as you get to the top.
Yeah, actually, that's very true. And very consciously that's true. So I just want to point something out. So in this painting, we clearly read things as being closer to us and being further away. So this is further away from us than this, or this is further away from us than this. So we know that because of perspective, because the artist has paid careful attention to proportional relationships, like the way things get smaller as they move away from us. It's true in that painting too. We know that this is further away from us than this. Like what's something that tells us that this is further away from us than this?
The density, I think, and detail.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is something called atmospheric perspective. So when we're outside looking at the landscape, things that are further away from us appear softer and less clear than things that are closer to us. So things that are closer to us, we can see more detail than things that are further away. It has to do with the way atmosphere interferes with our optical abilities, right? The atmosphere creates refraction of light and particulate interference. So things that are further away don't appear as clear to us. And so Monet is taking note of that and painting that. Holbein has drawn this table in perspective. He's drawn that lute in perspective. He's drawn the figures, for that matter, in perspective, in linear perspective. In other words, that drawing element that shows us how things get smaller as they move away from us. But that's not exactly happening in Joan Mitchell. And yet, I think Diana's right. This appears closer to us than this, which is closer to us than this or this, and it's closer to us than that white in the background. So why is that? Like, why do these things appear closer to us than this, or even than this? Like if we sort of step back and look at the whole painting overall, this, I think, is fair to say, appear closer to us than this. Why is that the case?
Isn't it just like a trick of the same principle?
Yeah, it's a trick of the same principle. That's right. She's using the same principle, actually. So she's using, on the one hand, perspective. Do people know what I mean by perspective? What's perspective? So perspective is something we're going to go over. We can't study it extensively. Can anyone here define perspective as it applies to art?
Yes.
So how do you define it?
So how do you see things? Like you see some object in front of you, and some are far away from you. So you find that like a one way perspective. Like you can see. You focus on one object, and you see the other object.
Yeah. So perspective is
Being two-dimensional, like how something is the height, the depth.
Yeah. So perspective is this principle, right? What it really is a mathematical system that artists use to help us understand how we can represent objects as clearly diminishing in size in a way that's consistent and believable in an image, right? So perspective was an invention of the Renaissance, and it's really the primary element that allowed works of art to transition from being purely symbolic to being images that we believed were convincing representations of the world. So you can study perspective very intensively so that you really understand all the details, all the properties of perspective. So the concept is that this slab is the same size as this slab if we actually measured them, but we see them as being different sizes depending on how close they are to us. And lines that are parallel to one another in reality, as they move away from us, will diminish towards a common vanishing point on the horizon line, which represents the eye level of the viewer. It's an elaborate system of communicating how objects appear larger or smaller to us, depending on how close or how far away they are. So we will go over perspective because perspective is an important element in understanding how to do the kind of painting we're doing. So Holbein fully understands perspective and is using it here. Monet does too. He's not using it in any obvious way, but he's fully understands perspective. Joan Mitchell isn't using it in any traditional way, but she's conscious of perspective in the way, for example, notice how that brushstroke is wider here and narrower here. So she's very consciously thinking of those kinds of brushstrokes as moving into the space of the painting. And then other brushstrokes, like this one, for example, she understands how that brushstroke reads as two-dimensional and flat. Like that brushstroke reads almost like a bow tie. You know, like we're looking straight at a bow tie, like it's flat to the surface of the page. This brushstroke is moving into the page or into the space. This brushstroke is moving into the surface. This brushstroke is flat on the surface. This brushstroke is moving slightly in to the space. So Joan Mitchell is constructing this elaborate tension between marks that move into the space and marks that reinforce the surface of the page. And then all of these marks, all of these colored marks, which are balanced in terms of color. Like notice the way she balances the greens throughout the painting. It's a complex balancing of greens, complex balancing of reds, complex balancing of blues. All of these marks are held together almost as if they want to like burst away from each other, but they're being held in a kind of like tense cohesion. You know, there's a sense of a kind of energy where they all want to explode, but they are nevertheless being held with this kind of tense energy. And she's creating that tension, which I think relates to our read of the painting as somehow being angry. She creates that tension by balancing, in part by balancing these spatial marks with these marks that sit on the surface. So those marks in relationship to each other create that kind of tension that we're experiencing in the painting. Notice here how this brushstroke seems to be facing us, and then it turns direction and changes color and moves backwards in space. So Joan Mitchell is getting at a kind of in a way she gets at a kind of profound sense of a kind of inner state, right? Having to do with like anger, turmoil. She makes us feel that very strongly without being distracted by an image that is meant to refer to, you know, something we see in the world. So her intent, you know, and what she was trying to do was make us feel that inner state much more profoundly because we're not distracted by external information. But Joan Mitchell isn't able to achieve that because she's just randomly putting marks down. If all Joan Mitchell did was that, all we would see are random scribbles and we would have no experience with the work of art. She's constructed this incredibly elaborate tension, composition, relationship between different marks, different very carefully considered colors. And that's all the result of a long and very rigorous study of the complex rules of painting or the complex techniques of painting. So Joan Mitchell was an artist who studied this kind of painting. And it allowed her to create these incredibly complex, and I think in the end, incredibly convincing abstractions. And so, again, in some ways, our focus will seem narrow, but I think it's a focus that leads to a foundation that can have ultimately profound implications. So this is a contemporary painting, a painting that was done, it's not quite contemporary, 1995. It's an artist named Kerry James Marshall. And so here, this is a representational painting. Although it's a little bit different in some ways from the Monet or the Ingres or the Holbein. different in some ways from the Joan Mitchell. Kerry James Marshall, he's a little bit older than me, I think. So, he's not a young artist, but he's a contemporary artist. And he's an artist making work about contemporary lived reality, right? So this is a painting of two figures in a housing project in Los Angeles, which is where Kerry James Marshall grew up. So he's making work that is, about contemporary lived experience. So very much unlike the work we've just been looking at, right? Like Holbein's making work about a 15th century political narrative. And Monet was engaged in a late 19th century endeavor to really understand the way we saw the world. And his paintings were all made in the French countryside. So here's an artist making paintings today, in a reality that is much closer to the reality that we all experience. So what is, and in some ways very different from the artists we looked at, but in some ways shares many of the same fundamental elements. And Kerry James Marshall is an artist who looks extensively at art history, and I should say art histories, because he looks at a wide range of cultural sources to build up his vocabulary. But I'm just curious, just as a way of starting to talk about different paintings, like what do people see going on here? Like even if you just sort of describe what's happening, or if anybody has any interpretations, I'd be interested to hear that too. And I know, some people may be at the beginning of thinking about painting, so.
It looks like there are half a dozen different styles of painting in this painting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's something that characterizes Kerry James Marshall's work. So what are those styles? Like what are some of those approaches?
I mean, he's still using perspective, sure, but it's very, like there's a lot of overlay on the work, I guess, because of the writing.
Yeah.
The other ones. It's
both
like
of those are true. And both of those are, like, I think we could call them two different styles. But one thing he's using is perspective, right? He's using perspective in that he's giving a sense of the movement back in space of the courtyard, right? By employing perspective on that pathway, and then employing perspective on the windows and the architecture of that building. Now, I don't know if Kerry James Marshall actually, sorry, let me just, I'm gonna mute and then ask someone to go down and get that.
What was the name of this artist? Was it Kerry James Marshall? I wasn't sure if I caught it.
Yeah, he said Kerry James Marshall.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. The artist's name is Kerry. So his first name is Kerry. His middle name is James, James. And then his last name is Marshall, Marshall. Kerry James Marshall is a very, maybe the most famous American painter working today. I mean, that's maybe debatable, but very famous American artist. So you'll be able to find a lot of information about him. So Kerry James Marshall is using perspective for sure. He's using perspective sort of influenced by a kind of early Italian approach to perspective painting. And Kerry James Marshall, when he talks about Western art history, he often refers to the early Italians. I'm not positive that they are his favorite amongst Western art, but he talks about them a lot. What are some other things? So that's a traditional element that Kerry James Marshall is using. And Kerry James Marshall studied with a very traditional artist named Charles White, who taught at the Otis Art Institute in California. And so he learned very traditional drawing and painting from Charles White. Where else are traditional elements? Like, what else about this could we call like traditional and coming out of Western painting?
That reflection of light in the
The way
color.
the way he's using light. So he's thinking
Like on
about
the clothing specifically, I think.
whose is that? He's using light and shadow in parts of the painting, not everywhere, but in parts of the painting. And so he's making use of that. Like, you'll notice it here on the legs, on the figure, this figure here in the foreground. You know, there's a sense of this landscape being illuminated by daylight. And we are clued into that by this, right, which is a symbolic representation of sunlight. So symbolic as opposed to the technical term for the way Monet was representing sunlight would be mimetic, M-I-M-E-T-I-C, meaning imitating the way it looks, where this is symbolic. And so that's another aspect of Kerry James Marshall's work. So he combines the mimetic or the representational with the symbolic. What else is going on in here? So we've talked about like traditional representational elements, perspective, light and shadow. What else do we see going on?
I think with his paintings, he talks about like world issues. I went to one of his exhibits before in the Met Brewer, and yeah, like with this one, it does like gardens, and he has like the projects and stuff. And so I feel like a lot of his paintings are like there's like a message behind it.
Yeah, so that's for sure. There's a complex cultural, historical narrative, right? Like his paintings are in a way complex history paintings. Like sort of in the same sense as this Holbein. Oops, not. So this Holbein painting is a painting that is meant to narrate a history of the time, where Kerry James Marshall's paintings are also very consciously about narrating a history of African American experience, right? And related to his experience as a young man growing up being born in the South and then being raised in Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s. He talks about the experience of growing up in projects. So he did a series of work that were all based on housing projects in Los Angeles and Chicago. And so that's the name of the housing project, Wentworth Gardens. And so there's that, that important conceptual narrative element. And so mentioning that or bringing that up, can anyone talk about or see the ways that the formal elements, so I know that term may not be, what I mean by that may not be clear. So we just mentioned the narrative in the painting, right? It's a narrative of a specific contemporary cultural history and cultural experience, having to do with the experience of being African American in the United States in the 50s, into the 60s and 70s. And that would be the narrative, right? The subject matter or the narrative, that would be the conceptual objective. Like that's the experience he's talking about. And then sometimes in contrast to that, we talk about the formal elements of the painting. So like form as opposed to content, formal as opposed to content. So the content is that historical narrative that he's addressing. The form are all those elements that construct the painting sort of separate from the content, but they're always related. So I'm wondering if anyone can think about what are those formal elements he's using? And how do they relate to the experience he's talking about? I know that might be a very open-ended question. And if that's not a clear question, just please tell me. What about, like, why would, one of the first things people observed was that Kerry James Marshall is using a complexity of styles, or there's a kind of overlapping of styles. Why would he be doing that? What are the implications of that? Like, in a way, just that in itself would be a formal observation. Like, Kerry James Marshall is using a multitude of different approaches to making the painting. But what could possibly be a narrative implication of that? In other words, like, how would that relate to the story he's telling?
Well, the story would have multiple narratives.
Yeah, he's talking about a history that is made up of multiple narratives. And Kerry James Marshall's work is also about, on the one hand, it's very much specifically about African American experience. And Kerry James Marshall talks about that extensively. Like, he talks about the fact that the art history that he experienced as a student was primarily European, and he never saw, or virtually never saw, figures in those paintings that looked like him, except in the occasional sort of like supporting role in a painting, where he's very concerned with making paintings, engaging with the history of paintings, but making paintings that are specifically about and celebrate African Americans and the African American experience. So in that sense, his work is very specific. But he also talks very much about that experience in a complex and in some ways a fractured world, a world where identity and experience can't really be thought of as unified and governed by the same belief system, but instead it's an experience that takes place in a world that's defined by a multitude of belief systems and a multitude of points of view. So there's a kind of unity to this painting, right? Or there's a unity to this painting. And in a different way, there's a unity to this painting, right? And really, these are artists who are coming out of a time where art was thought of as embodying or containing like a essential underlying unified belief system that was equally important to everybody. But artists generally don't think about the world that way anymore. Artists generally think about the world, or often, let's put it that way, as experience that is made up of a complexity of points of view and complexity of experiences. And that's part of why Kerry James Marshall makes paintings that are made up of this complexity of styles. Because for him, the world can't be represented as unified really in any important way. The world is a complex experience, kind of overlap of experiences. So in terms of how he's making this painting, anyone notice, and what are some other things people notice about the paintings? What does this phrase refer to?
I think the project.
Well, definitely to the project. So the project is called Wentworth Gardens, right? But anyone recognize that phrase, better homes, better gardens? It doesn't sound familiar to anybody?
It sounds familiar, but I can't place from where. But like the overall feeling I get from that element of this painting, among others, is there something really like poster-like?
Poster-like, yeah. I mean, that's good. I mean, this
like it already looks like it's been framed in a way.
Right, that's true. No one wrote Better Homes and Gardens is actually something that just disappeared from our culture very recently.
Like the 50s.
Yeah,
somehow.
the 50s. And what specifically, what is it from the 50s?
I don't know.
It was like an advertisement for places to live, I guess.
Better Homes and Gardens was a mass market, very popular magazine that was targeted towards a kind of like mainstream middle class audience from around the 50s up until it only recently folded. You know, just like many magazines are folding. But it was a very popular mainstream magazine that advocated for a certain middle class conventional lifestyle. You know, it would give like gardening tips, home decorating tips, cooking, that kind of thing. So Kerry James Marshall is very deliberately juxtaposing the name of the housing project with this, right? And why is he doing that? Like, what's the implication of that? This gets more like the conceptual content of the painting.
Well, the words behind there say something like, "And watch your children."
Yeah, I know. I assume he's taking this just from his just from this sign, right? There's those kinds of like publicly posted warnings, right? Drive carefully and watch your children, right? Those kinds of like public service announcements. But Better Homes and Gardens, like, was Better Homes and Gardens, just by the way I described it, was its target audience people who were living housing projects in Los Angeles? Or was its target audience somebody else?
No, it was some wealthier people that had.
It was for wealthier people, right? It was for wealthier middle class people. Let's face it, it was made for white people, you know, in the 1950s, you know, up through at least the 80s. So Kerry James Marshall is deliberately eliminating those kinds of like cultural hierarchies, right? Those are kind of assumed cultural hierarchies that have to do with like a mainstream culture and then a marginalized culture. So he's deliberately eliminating those. He's also playing further on the idea of a garden. So he's hearkening back to, you know, a very famous, widely shared myth of a garden in this painting. Anyone know what I mean? Like, what's a garden? What's another garden he's referring to? So he's referring both to housing projects that exist to this day in Los Angeles. He's referring to mass culture, and a mass culture that's meant to advocate for and create a certain kind of consciousness and a certain kind of lifestyle. And then he's also referring to a garden myth. What's a famous garden myth? Everybody knows the answer to this question. You just think it's more.
Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden, right. Famous garden myths, Garden of Eden. How does this painting refer to the Garden of Eden?
I think like the dove and then the lighting in the background, like behind the trees. It has that like same.
Yeah, sure. And what about these two figures?
Yeah.
Like, who are those?
Yeah.
Like it's Adam and Eve.
Just. surprised I don't have this image. I'm gonna pull up an image. So this is a very famous painting by Masaccio of Adam and Eve being expelled from the Garden of Eden. So so Kerry James Marshall is playing with that too, right? He is deliberately referencing the Garden of Eden myth, and in a way, like condensing history, right? So the contemporary can be seen in terms of the mythological past. And as his work always does, it deals with the complexity of experience. So there's a tying in of this contemporary experience with the origins of human beings, or the mythological origins of human beings, and also dealing with the potential dangers of, leaving innocence, right, represented by these two figures. I think he deliberately uses that hose there to suggest the serpent, from the tree of the Garden of Eden. Why is that bocce ball there? Probably representing the forbidden fruit, at the same time that it represents something that these figures might have played with. And then I just want to point out one quick thing, and we will talk about this in our last assignment. The way all of these things are arranged, the way they're all put together in relationship to each other in this painting, is incredibly important. So notice how, why does Kerry James Marshall place the sign right there, right next to right under that brick wall, in relationship to this oval here? Why is that oval placed there? Notice that Kerry James Marshall has, we talked about that complexity of styles, the fact that suggests like a kind of lack of unity that the other paintings had. Kerry James Marshall goes as far as to include in an otherwise representational painting these kind of abstract expressionist marks, right? And sometimes Kerry James Marshall does that just because he thinks the painting needs something there. So he just puts a mark there. Like he thinks of himself as having, at this point for a painter, they have that freedom to do that. But notice, in spite of all that complexity, notice how he's done what we call compose the painting. So when I talk about composing the painting, or when we talk about composition, if people don't know what that means the way the artist has deliberately arranged the elements in the painting. And we can usually think about that as in order to create meaning in one way or another. So notice how, in spite of all this complexity and overlapping of different approaches, Kerry James Marshall has organized the painting that is a rectangle. And then he structured the painting as 1, 2, 3, 4 rectangles within that larger rectangle. He's very deliberately done that. So all of that complexity and maybe even like disharmony of information is actually constructed within the organization of those rectangles within the rectangle. Very deliberately, Kerry James Marshall is organizing the painting that way. And then notice that this oval is balanced here by this oval-like form, balanced here by this circle. So we have this triangle or this pyramid-like structure overlapping that structure of rectangles. So again, we have a kind of order underlying all of this complexity. And then this band that sort of snakes through the bottom gives another kind of order in the way this sets up a kind of like foundation at the bottom of the painting. So with all of this complexity, there's still a kind of underlying order to the painting that both allows the painting to make sense to us as viewers, but it also gives a kind of narrative, it feeds into the narrative, because Kerry James Marshall is asserting that in spite of this complexity of experience, we still have this, it still leads to a kind of ordered, integrated, coherent identity, I think, which is an important part of his work. Kerry James Marshall is another artist who takes very seriously the way some of those fundamental elements of painting can be reconstructed and woven together into what I think are, in the end, incredibly profound paintings that get at contemporary experience. And hopefully for people who go further as an artist, beyond this class, we'll be able to use some of these things we talk about in that way. So I'm going to stop talking about other paintings today. I have other images in this slideshow, but I'm going to be showing them as the semester progresses. Because I think I've made the mistake in the past of showing too many images at the beginning. And so we sort of forget what they're about. So for today, I'm actually going to end here, unless there are any questions. I'm going to give, people have a chance to start getting their materials organized, getting their boxes together, that sort of thing. Try, if you can, try to get all the materials I asked you to get. Is anyone having trouble finding anything?
Yeah, I've had a couple things that I wasn't able to find here that I think gonna probably just have to order online and wait for.
Okay, what are they?
The palette paper pad.
So
I have like a palette. I just don't have like.
If you have a palette, that's fine.
Oh, okay, cool. That was kind of my hope or assumption.
No, palette paper is just the convenient way to have a palette for anyone who's just starting out brand new. It's actually, they were more expensive than I thought. No, but if you have a palette, that's totally fine. What material is it made out of?
I think it's just like a plastic palette.
Okay, that's totally fine. Yeah, so for the palettes for everybody, some artists use those palette papers that I asked you to buy, because at the end of the day, you can just rip off that page and throw it away. You can just rip off that sheet and throw it away. But you can also use, you could use a plastic surface. You can use a clean, like I said, a clean cookie sheet, something like that. You can use a sheet of glass. You can go to an art supply store and buy a palette, like a plastic palette. And it may actually be cheaper. You just have to clean it off every day.
Yeah. There are a couple other, I couldn't find one of the brushes, the size 2 filbert. The store I went to was just out of them.
Okay. I mean, if you want, you could get, something similar to that, but not having that brush isn't going to make that big a difference, I don't think.
Yeah. So that, and I couldn't really find I couldn't find a paper mache cone. I did find a cone. It is not made of paper mache. It's
What's
like
it made of?
It's like some kind of foam.
Yeah, did you get that?
Yeah.
That's fine. To make it really work for the class, I would just ask you to wrap it in paper.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because it's not a smooth reflective surface.
Right. So it's going to be hard to see light on it as it is, but that's fine. Just wrap it in paper and that'll work perfectly well.
Okay, so that, and then I found I got like a light at a hardware store, but I'm not sure yet if it'll work for our purposes. I don't
really know. Will. What kind of light is it?
It's like a clip-on lamp. I'm not.
It'll probably work. you know, a lot of lights will work. Like a conventional desk lamp will work. You know, those kinds of LED lights that they sell nowadays. Like, you know, I have a couple of them.
Professor, I have desk light. Is it working?
Let me see. Who's asking? Selena? Who's asking?
This is Selena.
Can I see the light?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll work. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Selena, you might try to get a different bulb. Like if you're able to go to the hardware store and get a bulb that has the equivalent of 100 watts,
Okay.
that will work a little bit better than that bulb you have, but that'll work.
Okay.
So that kind of light will work. If people have this kind of light, let me just pull this up on Amazon. So clip on. You know, these kinds of lights will work. I actually bought one of these lights. That didn't work so well. I thought that would work. But these kind of lights work, like this kind of thing. I don't know if anyone has this. That kind of thing works. So a lot of different lights will work.
Would like just a flashlight work?
No, probably not. That's probably too directed a beam.
Hmm.
Probably not. You can try it, but I don't think so. So, you know, again, ideally, I'm not sure I can say ideally, but that kind of light, like I have one right here. You know, this kind of light is best. I mean, this kind of light works very well. I'm not going to say it's best because I haven't tried, but you know, and these are not expensive at a hardware store. I don't remember exactly what it was. I think it's something like $8. It might actually be cheaper. I know if you can get it at Home Depot for like $6.99.
I didn't see anything like that. I went to the Home Depot the other day and it just didn't have lights like that.
Maybe ask. Did you ask?
Yes, I didn't see, there was nothing. That's why I got the kind of little lamp.
I don't know where you live, but if you can go to an Ace hardware store, they also, that's where I bought mine.
I don't know if I have one.
You got one at the hardware store?
Ace.
Ace, yeah. You can, you know what? You know what's annoying about Home Depot? Home Depot is this enormous store, but they are out of things a lot. It's so frustrating.
Well, the bulbs I couldn't get from the 150 watt bulb. I couldn't get from.
But if, you know, but if you use it like a 60, 100, that's all fine.
Okay.
So any other questions? I will send the materials list and those emails to people today. I'll send that again so that everyone knows.
I just have a question about like how the class will work tomorrow. Like you said that you're gonna do a demonstration, but are you gonna tell us like what materials to use and like?
Yeah, all of that. I'll talk about that very clearly. I'll set it all up, walk you all through that. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Also, how many boxes are we going to need?
You just need one.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Do you are you gonna send an email for the Zoom each time every day for class?
I'll send an email every morning at around the same time.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. Okay, so if there aren't any questions, I'll try to have Blackboard set up today. Again, if it's still glitching, I may not be able to. If there are no questions, we'll just meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. Okay.
Is there a schedule somewhere of like which days we're going to be, what was the word, like meeting
Yeah,
synchronistically?
asynchronous.
And huh?
Yeah, it's on the syllabus.
Oh, okay. I didn't notice it. Sure.
Yeah, it's headed lesson plan. I go day by day.
So is there a way to know in advance which days we're going to?
Yeah, so so if you look at the syllabus, so this week for sure, so June 29th is today with slides. Tomorrow is a demonstration. Then Wednesday is going to be asynchronous. So this
Oh, okay.
is Wednesday. Okay. Thursday we'll do another demo. Next week on July 6th will be a demonstration. July 7th, so next Tuesday will be asynchronous. July 8th will be a demonstration. Next Thursday, July 9th will be asynchronous. So independent work on color stars and painting, that's asynchronous.
So Professor, when you give us the demo, we have to paint at the same time, or we can have time later on?
No, if you mean on days that are asynchronous?
Yeah.
No, I mean, you can do that at any time you want.
Okay, thank you.
You know, and that's an advantage to online teaching. So no, that's fine. Yeah, you're free to construct your schedule as it works best for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I'll end the meeting today. People can email me with any questions, and otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow morning at around 9 a.m.
See you tomorrow.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
Professor.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.